All right, wonderful. Thank you everyone again for joining us today, and good afternoon. Welcome to
Welcome.
today's plenary, which is Reflections on a Century of Building Black Collections, the Schomburg Center and the Harlem Renaissance at 100. Today's plenary speaker is Barrye Brown, Curator of Manuscripts, Archives, and the Rare Books Division at the Schomburg Center for Research and Black Culture in New York City. Barrye received her BA in History from Dillard University, MA in History with a focus on Atlantic World and African Diaspora from Rice University, and her MLIS from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where, as a Carolina Academic Library Associate, she held dual appointments in the Southern Historical Collection and the Sonia Haynes Stone Center Library for Black History and Culture. Prior to her arrival at the Schomburg Center, Barrye served as the reference and outreach archivist at the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture at the College of Charleston. She is also a 2022 to 24 Rare Book School Mellon Cultural Heritage Fellow. In the spirit of our conference theme, Renaissance and Renewal, Barrye will reflect on the Schomburg Center's centennial of building Black collections and institutions from the Harlem Renaissance into the 21st century. Barrye, we're so looking forward to your plenary talk today. Let me see if I can go ahead and queue up your slides.
And while you're trying to do that, can everyone hear me? I hope so.
Yeah, well, I can hear you for sure. So yeah, all right, let me see. I'm just gonna navigate to sharing my screen here. All righty, so I think I've got that ready to share. All righty, and we'll go to slideshow. All righty, Barrye, I think we are ready to go.
Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's plenary, Building Black Collections and Institutions During the Harlem Renaissance, the Schomburg Center at 100. I can't tell you how excited and incredibly honored I am to speak with you today, not only because it's my first MARAC conference, but also because I have the pleasure of talking about the Schomburg Center's upcoming centennial celebration. I'd like to give a very big thank you to Hillary and Megan for inviting me to give today's talk. When we first spoke about MARAC's conference theme, Renaissance and Renewal, I thought that sharing the almost 100-year history of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a historic institution born of and within the Harlem Renaissance, would be a perfect fit. Today, oh, not yet, Hillary. Today, the Schomburg Center is a world-renowned institution and research library focused on materials that document the global African diaspora. Before I dive into today's talk, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about myself and how I arrived at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Next slide, please. So my journey to the archival profession stems from my love of history and community. That passion was inspired by being raised by my grandmother, Adelia, who's pictured here, who was born in Sparta, Georgia in 1909. She would tell me a number of stories about growing up as a Black woman in the South, traveling with her father, who was a Congregationalist minister, playing the piano and the organ at different churches, teaching at segregated schools, and meeting Zora Neale Hurston while her father was teaching at Selma University in Alabama. My grandmother's stories painted such a vivid and colorful portrait of Black life and made history come alive for me. These were certainly not the depictions of Black life that I encountered in my school textbooks. So, from a very early age, I knew that I wanted to find a career that would allow me to preserve and share these kinds of stories in order to transform the historical record. I pursued history as my major in undergraduate and graduate school. I obtained a bachelor's degree in history from Dillard University, which is a historically Black university located in New Orleans, Louisiana. And from there, a master's degree in Atlantic World History with a focus on African Atlantic Diaspora from Rice University in Houston, Texas. While visiting the Amistad Research Center as a graduate student, I happened to have a conversation with the archivist there, Ms. Brenda Square, about my desire to preserve and make accessible stories like my grandmother's, She asked me if I ever thought of pursuing a career in archives. I had not. I asked her, how does one become an archivist? And she told me that I needed a degree in library science. From that moment, I connected with different professors and archival professionals about pursuing a graduate degree in library science. These conversations provided excellent guidance in helping me to identify graduate schools that have strong archives and special collections programs. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill seemed to be a great fit for my professional pursuits. Next slide, please. While attending UNC Chapel Hill, I worked for 2 years as a Carolina Academic Library Associate, also known as a CALA, with a dual appointment in the Southern Historical Collection, as well as the Sonia Haynes Stone Center Library for Black Culture and History. As a CALA, I had the opportunity to work on a variety of archival projects, such as UNC's African American Family Documentation Initiative, as well as gain experience working in a subject area library focused on African American history and culture. I graduated from UNC Chapel Hill with a master's degree in library science with a concentration in archives and records management. Next slide, please. I started my first job out of library school as a reference and outreach archivist at the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture at the College of Charleston in 2015. There, I got to know and work with the incredible communities and collections of the Low Country region. Next slide, please. In 2018, I came to the Schomburg Center as a processing archivist. The first collection I processed were the papers of writer Ann Petrie, the first Black woman to sell over 1 million copies of her debut novel, The Street, in 1946. In 2022, I became the curator of the Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books Division, where I am primarily responsible for the day-to-day management of the division and its staff, acquisitions, donor relations, exhibition loan requests, media requests, outreach, instruction, digital projects, and administering a number of grants. You name it, I do it all. Next slide, please. My entire career thus far has focused on working with collections of the African diaspora. To work with Black collections each and every day has been a dream come true for me. As an undergraduate student at Dillard, I remember my professors talking about the Schomburg Center as the Mecca of Black history and culture. And I remember thinking to myself, maybe I can work there someday. Talk about manifesting, right? After such a roundabout journey to the archival profession, I feel like I'm exactly where I always hoped to be, and at such an important moment in the center's history. It's not every day that a Black collecting institution turns 100, so I'm thrilled that we can celebrate this historic milestone together. When thinking about how the Schomburg Center came to be, community is at the heart of the Schomburg Center's story. For it was the diasporic Black communities in Harlem that demanded books by and about Black people, a community who wanted to see their lived experiences reflected in the tomes of the 135th Street Branch Library. It's also the community and social networks of Black artists, authors, librarians, and bibliophiles who gathered in Harlem in the early 20th century, who contributed their works and labor to build an institution where their intellectual and creative legacies would remain for future generations. While the Schomburg Center bears the name of the famous Afro-Puerto Rican bibliophile, Arturo Schomburg, please know that the story of the Schomburg Center also belongs to the various community members, both famous, such as author Claude McKay, poet Langston Hughes, and artist Aaron Douglas, just to name a few, but also to those who are lesser known, such as the Black librarians at the 135th Street Branch Library, who helped steward the collections and serve the public. With that being said, I would like to start by introducing our namesake, Arturo Schomburg, whose collection and collecting philosophy form the very groundwork upon which the Schomburg Center operates today. Next slide, please. Arturo, also known as Arthur Alfonso Schomburg, is the most famous bibliophile of the African diaspora. He was born on January the 24th, 1874 in Puerto Rico and moved to New York City in 1891, settling in Harlem and later in Brooklyn. As a young man, he was an active supporter of Cuban and Puerto Rican independence from Spain, co-founding the political club Las Dos Antillas. Later, he was involved in several organizations devoted to promoting African American research and scholarship, including the Negro Society for Historical Research and the American Negro Academy. Drawing on his extensive collection of books and historical documents, Schomburg wrote articles on the history of the African diaspora for major Black periodicals, including The Crisis, Opportunity, Negro World, and the New York Amsterdam News. Schomburg was a lifelong collector of books, pamphlets, manuscripts, and artwork relating to the African diaspora. Collecting, to him, was a way to recover Black history and document Black intellectual and cultural achievement. I'd like to share a widely circulated story that speaks to Schomburg's origins as a collector. Next slide, please. When Schomburg was a child in grade school, he once asked a teacher, when would they learn about people who looked like him? In other words, Black history. The teacher told Schomburg that there was no such thing, that Black people didn't have a history because they haven't done anything worthy to contribute to society. When I think of this story, it makes me so angry to think that a teacher would say such a vile and disgusting thing to a child. But simultaneously, when I think about this story, I'm amazed and grateful that even as a child, Schomburg had enough sense and self-worth to know that what this teacher said was not true. It's this moment that set Schomburg on his path to collect what he later called vindicating evidences in his landmark essay, The Negro Digs Up His Past. Next slide, please. The clearest articulation of Schomburg's collecting philosophy can be found in his essay, The Negro Digs Up His Past, first published in the March 1925 special edition of Survey Graphic called Harlem, Mecca of the New Negro, edited by the Dean of the Harlem Renaissance, philosopher Alain Locke. In this essay, he introduces his concept of vindicating evidences as records of Black achievement. Schomburg writes, quote, "The Negro has been a man without a history because he has been considered a man without a worthy culture." End quote. Collecting evidence of this culture was a way to provide Black people with the, quote, "spiritual nourishment of our cultural past," end quote, and to tell, quote, "the full story of human collaboration and interdependence," end quote. He collected from all over the world, corresponding with booksellers in France, Germany, the Netherlands, and elsewhere, and traveled to Cuba and Spain on book collecting trips. Friends and acquaintances, many writers and bibliophiles themselves, often sent him books frequently signed and inscribed to Schomburg. For Schomburg, collecting evidence not only enabled the first true writing of Black history, but also forged a recasting of American history. In addition, embedded within Schomburg's collecting philosophy is a commitment to serve Black communities across the diaspora through collecting and ensuring that Black history and culture are accessible to the public. This essay would be republished in Alain Locke's groundbreaking volume, The New Negro and Interpretation. Next slide, please. The institution that bears the name of Arturo Schomburg is the product of a particular time, place, and circumstance. Founded in the midst of the 1920s, the precursor of the current Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the 135th Street Branch Library, emerged as one of the leading cultural centers of the Harlem Renaissance. This is a photo of the original 135th Street Branch Library, which was built in 1905. At that time, the demographics of Harlem were mostly made up of white immigrant communities. From 1900 into the 1920s, the Black population of Harlem grew immensely as a result of the Great Migration from the American South. You also had an influx of Black populations migrating to New York and settling in Harlem from the Caribbean. Libraries are meant to serve their communities, and by the 1920s, with the majority Black population in Harlem, there was a growing demand for books and other resources by and about Black people. In 1920, Miss Ernestine Rose was appointed head librarian of the 135th Street branch. Ms. Rose recognized the importance of reflecting the community within the staff, so that same year, she hired Catherine Latimer, the New York Public Library's first Black librarian. Ms. Rose went on to hire more Black librarians in the early 1920s, which I will talk about in a bit more detail a little later. This would make the 135th Street branch the first New York Public Library branch with an integrated staff. In 1924, Arturo Schomburg, along with journalist John Edward Bruce, writer James Weldon Johnson, and others, formed a citizens committee to establish a non-circulating reference collection in the 135th Street branch library devoted to, quote, books and documents relating to the Negro race, end quote. Working with the head librarian, Ernestine Rose, the collection opened on May 7, 1925, as the Division of Negro Literature, History, and Prints. The division became both a repository for a unique collection of books, archival and manuscript materials, and artwork by and about Black people, and also the setting in which the study and interpretation of Black history and culture were given new meaning for scholars, artists, intellectuals, and the general public alike. Next slide, please. In a letter dated October the 6th, 1925, Rose wrote to Schomburg about obtaining his collection for the library. The letter reads as follows. My dear Mr. Schomburg, I have just returned from my vacation and shall hope to see you about a number of matters. Particularly, am I anxious to discuss with you the possibility of obtaining your invaluable collection of Negro literature for our library. Mrs. Latimer has told me that Mr. G.F. Peabody is interested in it for a university in Africa, but you know, I am sure, how much we want it and how much it is needed right here in America. Will you hold Mr. Peabody off until we can discuss the matter and decide what is possible? Very truly yours, Ernestine Rose, branch librarian. Finally, on May 12, 1926, so the following year, a sale was negotiated for $10,000 after the New York Public Library received a grant from the Carnegie Corporation. As you can see here in this document to the right, this is the resolution from the Board of Trustees from the New York Public Library attesting to the purchase of this collection through Carnegie funds. Schomburg's collection, consisting of 2,932 volumes, 1,124 pamphlets, and many valuable prints and manuscripts, was delivered in 104 crates to the Central Research Library, now called the Stephen A. Schwarzman Building, in May of 1926 for cataloging before being deposited at the 135th Street Branch Library. The public sale of this collection was monumental and lauded in a number of newspapers with headlines stating, Famous Library of Arthur A. Schomburg purchased for $10,000, and the Schomburg Negro Library sold for $10,000. Next slide, please. Here are two such announcements, including one that appeared in Opportunity magazine titled, The Schomburg Library Open to Students. The article states that, quote, Mr. Schomburg's desire to have this collection available in a strategic center to students of Negro life and his wish to stimulate the aspirations of young Negro literary talent were largely responsible for the good fortune which has come to the library and to these students, end quote. At the time of the sale, many of Schomburg's contemporaries, such as librarian Arna Bontemps and journalist J.A. Rogers, knew that even at this price, his collection was grossly undervalued, with Bontemps saying that $10,000 was not even a fifth of its value. As Dr. Laura Helton states in her book, Scattered and Fugitive Things, How Black Collectors Created Archives and Remade History, despite the modest price, for Schomburg, this sale was symbolic as well as pragmatic and publicly confronted the charge that Black books and, by proxy, the Black lives they chronicled had no value. In regards to the sale, Schomburg stated, quote, "Some of those books are actually priceless and cost a great deal of money. Others, not so rare, cost less. But the whole amount hardly gives me back the money I spent to get them. My time, labor, etc., go free, and I give them gladly. I would have gladly given the books outright had I not felt, in a way, that it would have been unfair to the public, for as a gift, they might not have been deeply appreciated as they are by having cost something. Those who know what they cost naturally feel there must be some real value attached to them," end quote. This sale granted the collection institutional value and longevity, which had always been Schomburg's goal. His collection vastly increased the size of the existing Negro division, and it became what we like to call today the seed library, which forms the nucleus of the modern-day Schomburg Center. Next slide, please. So here we have some photos that really transport us back a century ago. These are images of the reading room of the Negro Division of Literature, History, and Prints. So here, the photo on the right, if you notice the woman sitting behind the desk, that's Catherine Latimer. Next slide, please. So these are some of the photos of the integrated staff of the library. Again, the photo on the right, the woman sitting behind this desk, that's Ernestine Rose. So I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge an often overlooked group of individuals who helped build Black collections and institutions, the Black librarians of this period. Next slide, please. Earlier, I mentioned Catherine Latimer as the New York Public Library's first librarian. First Black librarian, who was in charge of the Schomburg collection from the moment it arrived in 1926 to 1932. But there are many other Black librarians who started their careers in the 135th Street Branch Library during the Harlem Renaissance. I will highlight a few key figures here. So going from left to right, Regina Andrews was a librarian, author, civic leader, and community activist who began her career at the 135th Street Branch Library in 1923. Andrews' Harlem home, an apartment located at 580 St. Nicholas Avenue, known as the Dream Haven, functioned as a gathering place for many figures of the period, including Zora Neale Hurston, W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, and Countee Cullen. While at the 135th Street Branch, Andrews became involved in Du Bois's experimental theater troupe, the Krigwa Players, who initially performed in the basement of the library. After this group disbanded, Andrews co-founded the Harlem Experimental Theater with Dorothy Peterson and Harold Jackman. She was the first librarian appointed to lead a New York Public Library branch in 1938. In the center, we have Nella Larson, who is most famously known as the author of Passing, her second novel, which was published in 1929, that describes the real and psychological dangers that two women face while navigating the complexities of race and gender. Larson began volunteering at the 135th Street Branch Library in 1921 to help set up for a large Black art exhibition. At that time, she was encouraged by Ernestine Rose to seek formal training as a librarian. Upon Rose's suggestion, Larson became the first African-American student to enroll in the New York Public Library's library school. When she graduated in 1923, she briefly worked at the 135th Street Branch Library, where she managed the children's room. She left librarianship altogether once her novels began to receive acclaim. Lastly, on the slide, we have Pura Belpre, the first Afro-Puerto Rican librarian hired by the New York Public Library, who also credits Ernestine Rose for recruiting her as a bilingual library assistant in 1921. This marked the beginning of her lifelong service to children's librarianship, which would also span over 6 decades until her death in 1982. When Belpre accepted her first post at the library, one of her major charges was to make the library more accessible to the growing Spanish-speaking community in Harlem, which was composed mostly of Puerto Ricans. Part of her new job involved finding and using storybooks that were not only relevant to the Puerto Rican children in the neighborhood, but authentically Puerto Rican in their content too. When Belpre searched the stacks for titles that she might use in story hours with local children, she came up empty-handed. In her essay titled The Art of Writing for Children, Belpre states, "My first assignment was to read all the books on the fairy tale shelves. Thus, the folklore of the world opened for me. As I shelved the books, I searched for the folk tales I had heard at home and had told to my cousins and friends. To my amazement, I found not even one. A sudden feeling of loss rose within me. I wished so much to preserve this folklore for the children of this new land. I knew that the knowledge of his folklore would develop a sense of pride and identification in him. But how would I accomplish my wish? As I progressed in my apprenticeship from grade to grade, as was the custom then, my desire to make the folklore of the Puerto Rican child known grew stronger. This challenge sparked a fire in her to increase the library's holdings of Spanish language titles for children, but also the desire to preserve these folk tales through her own writing and storytelling. Next slide, please. So again, from left to right, we now have Sadie P. Delaney, who was a pioneer in the field of bibliotherapy and organized the Veterans Administration Hospital in Tuskegee, Alabama. Before assuming the post of chief librarian at the Veterans Hospital in 1923, Mrs. Delaney began her career in librarianship at the 135th Street Branch Library in 1920. There she found that immigrants and troubled children could be helped through bibliotherapy, which is the therapeutic use of reading materials. Her initial work in bibliotherapy received international attention. Mrs. Delaney also had a special interest in books dealing with Black history and literature and wanted to develop a collection with such a focus. She thus came to know Arthur A. Schomburg, the bibliophile and collector. Mrs. Delaney was cited for exceptional work at the library and founded the first Black professional women's club in New York City. To the right, we have Augusta Baker, very famous children's librarian, who began her career at the 135th Street Branch, where she was the first Black woman at the New York Public Library to receive a permanent position as a children's librarian in 1937. There, Baker began and led the effort to collect children's literature that positively portrayed people of color, a practice that the library still continues today. Baker went beyond just collecting diverse books. She actively encouraged writers and publishers to create books depicting people of color and diverse communities in a favorable light. In 1953, Baker was appointed Assistant Coordinator for Children's Services, making her the first African American librarian in an administrative position at the New York Public Library. Next slide, please. So last, but certainly not least, Jean Blackwell Hudson, pictured here with Langston Hughes, was a librarian, curator, writer, and educator who became the head of the Schomburg Collection in 1948 and the first woman to serve as chief of the Schomburg Center from 1972 to 1980. Hudson built the center into one of the world's greatest collections documenting the African diaspora. In 1964, she took a year-long leave of absence to work at the University of Ghana, building an Africana collection for their library at the behest of Ghana's president, Kwame Nkrumah, a former 135th Street Branch patron. On her return to the New York Public Library, Hudson worked to fundraise and lobby on behalf of the Schomburg Collection, which had outgrown the building located on 135th Street. Hudson's advocacy resulted in federal funding to construct a new building to house the collection, which opened in 1981. She retired in 1984. The successes of these librarians were not without struggle and opposition within the New York Public Library system. On many occasions, community support and advocacy from influential figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois were necessary to put pressure on the New York Public Library to acknowledge the skills and expertise of Black librarians, as well as to hire and promote them. In recent years, there has been an increase in research on many of these figures, and I'm so glad that we have the personal papers of Jean Blackwell Hudson and Regina Andrews, as well as the 135th Street Branch records and the Schomburg Center records to serve as evidence of the passion and dedication of these early Black librarians. In June 2024, the New York Times published an article titled, "New York's First Black Librarians Changed the Way We Read," which examines the important role of the Black women who ran libraries during the Harlem Renaissance, where they built collections and communities of writers and readers. Serving the community and preserving the past for future generations has always been at the heart of Black librarianship. And I'm happy to see that in some small part, these unsung visionaries are finally getting their due. Next slide, please. So now let's return back to the historical timeline of the Schomburg Center. So in 1932, oversight of the Schomburg collection shifted away from Catherine Latimer when Arturo Schomburg was hired to serve as the division's first curator. He would hold this post until his death in 1938. After Schomburg's death, the Division of Negro Literature, History, and Prints was renamed in his honor in 1940 at the recommendation of Schomburg's successor, Dr. Lawrence Reddick. The Schomburg collection continued to grow under the leadership of Reddick and Jean Blackwell Hudson. In 1972, the Schomburg collection was designated as one of the research libraries of the New York Public Library and became the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. In 2015, the Schomburg Center won the National Medal for Museum and Library Service, and in 2017, it was named a National Historic Landmark. Next slide, please. This brings us to the present. Next slide. Today, Arturo Schomburg's seed library has grown to over 12 million items, including books, photographs, artwork, films, and digital material. And the center that bears his name is one of the world's leading cultural institutions devoted to the collecting, preserving, and making accessible materials that document the lived experiences of people of African descent globally. The center is divided by format, and it is comprised of 5 distinct research divisions. They are the Jean Blackwell Hudson Research and Reference Division, the Moving Image and Recorded Sound Division, the Photographs and Prints Division, the Art and Artifacts Division, and finally, my division, Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books. The Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books Division's holdings, which are now over 1,000 collections, include the personal papers of luminaries such as James Baldwin, Malcolm X, Lorraine Hansberry, Maya Angelou, and of course, our namesake, Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, among many others. Our division also preserves the records of organizations and institutions, literary and scholarly typescripts, play scripts, sheet music, broadsides, programs and playbills, ephemera, and rare books. Our holdings represent a wide range of foreign language material, though the bulk are in English, French, and Spanish. In addition, our division is also responsible for maintaining the institutional records of the Schomburg Center. Our rare book holdings date from the mid-16th century through the 20th century, but the bulk of the titles are pre-1865 imprints. Next slide, please. For those of you who have never been to the Schomburg Center, the photo on the left is the current day entrance located at 515 Malcolm X Boulevard. In the photo to the right, you will see our lobby and atrium named after Harlem Renaissance poet Langston Hughes, who was a close friend of Arturo Schomburg's and a friend to the library in general. The lobby and atrium attach the present day building to the landmark 135th Street Branch building. On the floor of the atrium, you will see a beautiful public art installation called The Cosmogram by artist Houston Conwell. This installation serves as a peace memorial in honor of Langston Hughes and Arturo Schomburg. Inspired by Hughes's poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, the Cosmogram features 7 edited fragments of the poem that are positioned symbolically at relevant geographic locations. The final words of the poem, "My soul has grown deep like the rivers," are embedded in the body of a fish shape at the center of the circle. Langston Hughes's cremated remains are interred in a stainless steel book-shaped urn beneath this emblem. The terrazzo floor is marked by a brass cosmogram bearing songlines, text, and literary signs paying ancestral tribute in the tradition of African ritual ground markings, weaving a web of connections between people of diverse cultures and backgrounds, the past and the present. Two significant components of the cosmogram, the lifelines, are drawn in homage to ancestors Schomburg and Hughes. The lines symbolically pass through the places of their births, Puerto Rico, whose geographic location determines the outer circle of the cosmogram, and Joplin, Missouri, intersecting at the crossroads in Harlem, where they lived, achieved, and died. This is the most sacred space in the Schomburg Center. And in honor of this space, I'd like to recite the poem that inspired the installation, The Negro Speaks of Rivers by Langston Hughes. Next slide, please. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. Next slide, please. When visiting the Schomburg Center, I'd also like to highlight another incredible work of art that we are known for, our Aaron Douglas murals. Located in our Research and Reference Division's reading room, artist Aaron Douglas completed this 4-panel mural titled Aspects of Negro Life in 1934 through the Public Works of Art project. Douglas painted these murals to reflect African and African-American history, the African-American present, and his vision of a promising African-American future. The panels are subtitled The Negro in an African Setting, Songs of the Towers, From Slavery to Reconstruction, and An Idyll of the Deep South. As you can see in this photo, Schomburg and Aaron Douglas are looking at the Song of the Towers together. Also pictured here is the panel From Slavery to Reconstruction, which I saw used in the MARAC conference program. Next slide, please. So from Renaissance to Renewal, amplifying the work and the mission. In addition to the day-to-day work that we do, I'd like to highlight a combination of projects and programs to activate the collections, increase public engagement, and amplify the work that we are doing as we head into our centennial. We've been able to accomplish some remarkable things through the work of grant-funded projects over the last few years. I'd like to share some of the grants that we have received that have helped us expand our capacity and increase the accessibility of our collections. Next slide, please. Next slide. In 2018, the Schomburg Center received a $2 million Mellon grant to help support the Home to Harlem project. The title of this grant was inspired by an inscription to Arturo Schomburg from Claude McKay in his book, Home to Harlem. From 2018 to 2020, librarians at the Schomburg Center undertook a project to identify the books and pamphlets that made up the original Steed Library, using book plates, inscriptions, and other clues to determine which books had originally belonged to Arturo Schomburg. For context, there was never a definitive list or inventory of the titles that were part of the 1926 purchase. So it has taken some major library detective work to identify Schomburg's personal books. If you'd like to learn more about this endeavor, I'd encourage you to read an article titled Library Archaeology, Reconstructing a Catalog of the Arthur A. Schomburg Book and Pamphlet Collection, published in the summer 2021 issue of the African American Review. This grant has ended as of May 2024, but to date, we've identified over 3,000 books and pamphlets, which accounts for about 80% of the titles. Work to identify more titles is ongoing, and a full list of the Seed Library is forthcoming. This grant also allowed us to hire additional technical services staff to enhance our catalog records and provide more robust description to many in our finding aids that reflect our institutional history. Next slide, please. In 2022, the Fisk University and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture received, oh, sorry, next slide, please. Oh, in 2022, Fisk University and the Schomburg Center received a 2-year NHPRC planning grant for collaborative digital editions. This project is called Remaking the World of Arturo Schomburg. This marks the first partnership between the John Hope and Aurelia E. Franklin Library at Fisk University and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black History and Culture. This project seeks to make more visible the visionary work of Schomburg, especially during this moment when the legitimacy of Black and ethnic studies is under attack. This planning grant will conclude in December 2024, but I'm happy to report that we just received a Digital Justice Seed grant through the American Council of Learned Societies. This grant will give us additional time to continue the planning of a digital edition before we apply for a full implementation grant. So pictured on the right, I just want to give a shout out to the Schomburg Fisk project team. So my fellow project co-director, Delisa Minor-Harris, who's the Director of Library Services at Fisk University, and the project scholar editors, Dr. Laura Helton, who is at the University of Delaware, and Dr. Melanie Shameless, who is at University of Rochester. Next slide, please. Lastly, I'd like to highlight our most recent Mellon Grant supported project called the Next Century of Black Studies, which was awarded to us in 2023 and will continue through our centennial celebration into 2026. The primary goal of this project is to expand our capabilities to process collections and to make them accessible to the public. Through the funding of this grant, we have hired 2 processing archivists in our Moving Image and Recorded Sound division and 1 processing archivist from my division who has just finished processing a really important collection, the Institute of the Black World Records. So I'm so happy and excited that that is open to the public now. Next slide, please. These are just some of the highlights from the Black World collection thus far. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so exhibitions. So exhibitions are another way to increase public engagement with our collections and raise awareness of the Schomburg Center's mission. As a research library within the New York Public Library, we have a very robust exhibition loan program where we loan to institutions all over the world. The number of major exhibitions that the Schomburg Center has loaned to is too numerous to detail in the time allotted, so I'll highlight a few of the most recent at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Next slide, please. In 2023, the Met exhibition titled Juan de Pareja, Afro-Hispanic Painter, opened to the public. Curated by Dr. David Pullins and Dr. Vanessa Valdez, this exhibition offers an unprecedented look at the life and artistic achievements of 17th century Afro-Hispanic painter Juan de Pareja. Largely known today as the subject of the Met's iconic portrait by Diego Velázquez, Pareja was enslaved in Velázquez's studio for over 2 decades before becoming an artist in his own right. Harlem Renaissance collector and scholar Arturo Schomburg was vital to the recovery of Pareja's work and serves as a thread connecting 17th century Spain with 20th century New York, providing a lens through which to view the multiple histories that have been written about Pareja. So in this exhibition, the Met borrowed several of our rare book titles that were originally owned by Schomburg from the 16th and 17th century that reflect the presence of Africans in Spain and other parts of Europe. Next slide, please. One such title was Ad Catholicum by Juan Latino, who is largely known and celebrated as the first known person of African descent to publish a book of poetry in Latin. He was also a 16th century professor of rhetoric at the University of Granada in Spain. This is one of the titles that Schomburg truly treasured. Next slide, please. The Harlem Renaissance and the transatlantic modernism was an exhibition that opened this year in February. And it featured a number of works exploring the Harlem Renaissance from many Black collecting institutions, mostly HBCUs, but also the Schomburg Center, which loaned 13 pieces, the largest and most valuable of which being one of our Aaron Douglas murals. So if you go to the next slide, please. So here we are at the exhibition opening. It was really so exciting to see one of our Aaron Douglas murals amongst all of the other works by the artist. The Met has anywhere from 5,000 to 35,000 visitors in a single day. So to have this number of visitors encounter items from our collections is a great way to showcase the collections that we built over the last century. Next slide, please. So I had the honor and pleasure of curating my first exhibition this year in celebration of James Baldwin's centennial, called Jimmy, God's Black Revolutionary Mouth. The title of this exhibition is taken from a eulogy delivered by poet Amiri Baraka at Baldwin's funeral. And the exhibition highlights the literary career and legacy of writer, public intellectual, and activist James Jimmy Baldwin. The story of James Baldwin's journey to becoming one of the most prophetic and influential writers of the 20th century and an international literary icon is so deeply and beautifully intertwined with the history of the New York Public Library. His elementary school teachers encouraged him to go to the library because they noticed that he had a talent for writing and a love of reading, and his home library just so happened to be the 135th Street branch. Baldwin is often stated as saying, quote, "I went at least 3 or 4 times a week and I read everything there. I mean, every single book in that library. In some blind and instinctive way, I knew that what was happening in those books was also happening all around me. And I was trying to make a connection between those books and the life I saw and the life I lived," end quote. So before Baldwin died in St. Paul de Vence, France in 1987, he expressed a wish for his papers to come to the Schomburg Center. It took some time, but in 2017, 30 years after his death, the Baldwin papers finally came to the Schomburg, where they are joined by the archives of people he knew and loved in life, including Maya Angelou, Malcolm X, and Lorraine Hansberry, just to name a few. This is yet another example of how community members continue to build up the library's collections. Baldwin started out as one of our patrons and developed a deep love and appreciation for the mission and work of the library, so much so that he wanted his papers to be part of the Schomburg Center's legacy. We're so extremely proud to be the home to Baldwin's archive of personal papers, and to date, it is our most heavily used and requested collection. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the images from Jimmy God's Black Revolutionary Mouth. The exhibition will be open through February. So if you're in the New York area, please come check it out. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. So I just want to point out that we also offer funded fellowship programs. So our Scholars in Residence program, which was started in 1983, it has helped to support hundreds of scholars over the years. We also offer short and long-term fellowships through our Lapidus Center for the study of the transatlantic slave trade. Next slide, please. So K through 12 outreach, cultivating the next generation of scholars. Next slide. I just wanted to highlight a program that I'm also very proud of. So the Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program where each year 100 students from 5th through 12th grade get to participate in college-style lectures, presentations, group discussions, activities, and project-based learning. These students generate individual research, original writing, art portfolios, and collaborative multimedia projects. The students visit the archives each year, and the culmination of this research usually results in an exhibition at the Schomburg Center. Next slide, please. So this year's theme was Growing Up Black, and we pulled a number of items for the junior scholars to work with, which I've listed here. But the items that they were most inspired by are pictured here. It is the Black ABCs, which are a set of oversized flashcards created in the 1970s by the Society for Visual Education that reimagines and reinterprets the images and words associated with the alphabet. As you can see, each card features an incredibly beautiful and empowering image of Black children. All of the items that I pulled, they speak to the future-oriented work and thoughtful care that librarians, archivists, and curators have employed and continue to employ when thinking of what to collect for our young audiences. What a powerful experience for the children of today to see the beauty, brilliance, and creativity of Black children in the past. Next slide, please. As the Schomburg Center approaches its centennial, it's extremely unsettling to think of where we are today as a nation. A century later, the teaching and study of Black history and culture is under attack in a number of states. Censorship of books by and about Black people is on the rise, and access to information continues to be politicized and criminalized. The years 2025 and 2026 signify dual centennial celebrations for the Schomburg Center, marking the establishment of the Division of Negro Literature, History, and Prints in 1925 and the purchase of Arturo Schomburg's personal library collection in 1926. The mission and work of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture is more important than ever, as is the work of our curators, librarians, and archivists who have always taken an active stance against the whitewashing of the historical record. For a century, the books and archival collections of the Schomburg Center have formed the foundation of knowledge and cultural production by and about Black people, and has had an enormous impact on the growth and development of Black studies as an academic field. As we look towards the next century, let us imagine and continue to be inspired by the communities that built and continue to build these collections, as well as the visionary work of Arturo Schomburg, as we work to continue and expand his mission into the future and many celebrations to come. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I welcome any questions you may have or thoughts you might like to share as we ease into the rest of this amazing conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Barrye. Let me just stop sharing my screen now. Yeah, thank you for that wonderful journey that you took us on. It was like being in a time machine with you. And then I also feel like I am just ready for my visit to the Schomburg Center. So yeah, thank you.
I'm ready to receive you guys. Come visit me.
Yeah, wonderful. We have a few questions that have come in here on the chat. And first off, we have amazing presentations, so just want to echo that.
Yeah.
But also, you talked a little bit about your fellowship program, but we have a question of, do you have internship programs?
Unfortunately, at this time, we do not, but that is something that I'm hoping for in the future to offer some paid internship opportunities. So fingers crossed, maybe that's something that we can work on during the centennial. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, no, wonderful. So something for the next century, perhaps.
Yes.
So yeah, but not too far, hopefully.
Yep.
Next up, we have a question, if you can speak to this. Do you know why it took so long to get the Baldwin papers?
I can speak to it a little bit. So when Baldwin passed away, he certainly expressed that he wanted his papers to come to the Schomburg. However, when the papers were packed up, his first biographer, who was also his assistant, David Leeming, he requested through the estate, private access to the papers so that he could write the biography of James Baldwin. So I think that took it took a while, maybe 10 years or so. And then after that, it was a lot of negotiations with the family, especially about different restrictions associated with the papers. But eventually they made their way here and James Baldwin's dying wishes were fulfilled. So that's the reason why it took so long. The thing is, archives always take longer than what you think. So just want to put that out there to folks. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And all's well that ends well,
Yes.
it seems, in this case. Yeah, so I also just want to highlight that we've got a few just appreciations for your presentation. Really interesting, great work that you're all doing. Thank you. Some saying that they're coming to see the James Baldwin exhibit
Come
soon,
on.
which is wonderful to hear. And then also we have a question. What's the percentage of visitors that are African American? Just kind of thinking about like audience for the Schomburg.
That's a good question. It's like I would have to kind of check in with some of our volunteers and like our visitor coordinators. But yeah, it's like to be honest, it's like it's quite a diverse audience that comes to visit the Schomburg like day in and day out. And even when it comes to the demographics of our researchers, it's quite diverse. So it's really hard to say in terms of percentage, but certainly we have like quite a few international visitors like all the time as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's also just wonderful to
Mhm.
hear about like the diversity of audience. Yeah, so I think that is it for our questions. But I just wanted to also share that one attendee said that the Langston Hughes poem gave them cold chills, and thank you for sharing that. I
Oh,
was just also so interested to hear about Hughes's
ashes.
remains being,
Yeah.
yeah, part of the Schomburg, and yeah, just the beautiful artwork that you were able to share. So thank you for that. Many appreciations pouring in, yeah, for this plenary. So yeah, so thank you so much again, Barrye. It was wonderful. What a wonderful start to this conference, and yeah, we look forward to seeing everyone on Zoom over the next day and a half. But many, many thanks and appreciations again to Barrye for kicking us off. And yeah, have a wonderful one, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the conference. I know I will.
Yes, and we've got a vendor session, our first one coming up at 1:10. So just a reminder about that. But yeah, thank you all again.
Great. Bye.